Hello world. I've been having some camera problems as usual lately, and somehow I've managed to get the thing working, so I'm going to strike while the iron is hot and embark upon this reading I prepared on the matter of tourbillons, which was requested by somebody who'd been watching my channel and had a question about tourbillons. And this is a very astute question, and the person who asked about it rightly perceived that it holds the key to a great mystery and is an integral part of the tarot arcana. So, as well as honing in on one of the master keys, the question about tourbillons also highlighted one of the most fruitful ways of utilising the course materials left to us by Mebes, Shmakov, Rudnikova and Tomberg, which is to treat these books as the encyclopedias they were actually intended to be, especially the Mebes. I keep calling you Mebes, I'm sorry, that's my English pronunciation. The correct pronunciation is Mebes, so forgive me. People who watch my channel will realise that my pronunciation is often absolutely terrible, but there we go. Anyway, so the books are encyclopedias, occult encyclopedias. So if you take an important term such as tourbillons and related expressions such as astral whirlwinds, vortices, vortexes, and then you can search for their application in the text, and there you'll arrive at a more complete understanding of the occult principles in question. So in this case, the substance of tourbillons, they're intimately connected with the theory of binaries, which is at the crux of the whole matter, as anyone who's been keeping up will have realised. The resolution of binaries in a transcendental synthesis is the key hermetic task. And tourbillons, we're starting to investigate the mechanical functioning of the resolving of binaries with the tourbillons. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist. If I were, I'd probably explain it all a lot better. But hopefully you'll get the picture from what I've managed to extract from the real scientists' books. So, now, Mebes begins to explain the stationary and active forces that tourbillons exert within closed monads, such as the human being, the microcosm, and the world, the macrocosm. Whilst Mebes is an occult mage, and he focuses therefore on the astral implications of tourbillons, Shmakov, as readers will know, is much more metaphysical, and he offers great insight into the functioning of mental tourbillons. Now, to get cut to the chase of the texts, I'll begin with the master Mebes, as I like to call him, who points out that Arcanum 2, the High Priestess, of course, reminds us of the binary principle, and indicates its fecundity. He looks at phases of this fecundity and uses the example of two equal forces of opposing directions which, applied to a material point, condition the equilibrium of that point. The rough scheme of a binary helps us to understand that in general, manifestations are productive due to the existence of an opposition, the great Hegelian dialect. Without it, they remain unproductive. This is the same principle as the Hegelian dialect, where the friction caused by two opposing forces can and should lead both to progressively advance. Through Mebes, Shmakov, Tomberg and Rudnikova, we learn how the perfectly opposing forces are resolved by a transcendental synthesis, forming the ternary, the upward triangle. Now then, he continues to write about the act of neutralising binaries using examples. They're all very good examples, and we start with the static binary phase as follows. The line delimiting the positive and negative fields in the binary and balancing them can be displaced according to the circumstances, but the balance of the moment is always governed by the same scheme. An act or behaviour that neutralises the great binary of good and evil can, after a short time, fall into the region of good or evil, and at this new moment the binary is neutralised by a completely different act of behaviour, so circumstances change. Under certain conditions it may be appropriate for us to limit ourselves simply not to help a person. But 5 minutes later we may feel that our conscience compels us to do so through a certain beneficial action. The dividing line is in the balance, but the principle of neutralisation has not changed. Now, another phase of neutralising the binary is dynamic. The first is conditionally called static. And as an example, the same forces, parallel and equal to each other, are applied in opposite directions to two different points of the solid. This gives us an idea of rotational motion. This is exactly what we wanted to get, but we want more. And the idea of a stormy movement, of a whirlwind, of a tourbillon. We must imagine this movement applied to the astral matter. The impetuous astral vortices provoked by the powerful effort of will and imagination, forming swirls that spread and grow like spouts, are not governed by the same laws. And he says, I realise this is all a bit vague at this point, he's saying it's not permissible to reveal the secret of the general formation of these concentrated force fields, but we can allude to a particular case in which man instinctively creates such eddies which form individualised coagulates of matter and can be clearly perceived, proving thus its realising power. This work is linked to the matter of the neutralisation, as Mebes puts it, of the life-death binary. And here I'd like to recall that Nina Rudnikova actually says the binary is birth-death. And Nina Rudnikova had a very deep understanding of the binary process, to the point where she said that the art of living is the art of neutralising binaries. So she'd refined it to an even greater degree, so birth, death. Now, if you're not quite hooked into this yet, the way I understand the generation of tourbillons by a magus is, when we meet a person who has a powerful astral force, and it's often the astral force we recognise because that's linked to our emotions, and therefore the chemistry of individuals interacting is the astral substance of ourselves interacting. When you meet a person who's very powerful and has a great astral force and magnetism, they will draw people to them, and they will also expand themselves outwards. And this person, it could be conscious, it could be unconscious. It's usually a bit of both, unconscious to a degree and conscious to a degree, but they are generating these tourbillons, and they are essentially bending the world to their will. They are using these magical forces, these inner forces, these forces of the universe to their own advantage. So when you get very successful people, this charisma is part and parcel of the way they're generating, the means by which they're generating their tourbillons. Now then, the astral plane by definition is adjacent to the mental and physical. Therefore, imprints and reflections of those elements of the planes are close to its area and should be visible in it. The very condensed and typically grouped collectivities of ideas are reflected in the astral plane of the so-called astral ideas. Ideas already requested by the form, which are caught by metaphysicians and other scientists at those moments of their mental work when the question is about choosing forms for already chosen ideas. Often the same astral idea is caught by different scientists in closely related subplanes, and then we can see the simultaneous emergence of two or more systems which are similar but not identical. And he talks about calculus and Leibniz, differential calculus, and Newton's Fluxion method, which goes over my head because I don't know anything about maths, but maybe some of you do. Acts and phenomena realised in the physical plane through the subtle higher subplanes of the psychic plane are reflected in the astral as if in a mirror. and with these reflections are firmly fixed in this plane, given the so-called astral cliches of events of the physical plane. The astral sphere is not subject to the limited laws of three-dimensional space, nor of the time of a dimension. There you will find cliches of not only past but also future events. And if you suggest to me that future events are somewhat dependent on the volitional impulses of free individuals, I will answer you firstly, yes, it is. But each of our desires, each measure we take in the physical plane, partially alters the cliche of future events and may even erase them. Secondly, the higher this astral subplane in which one takes the cliche of the future event, the less that cliche changes and the better it predicts the event. And he says there is a great secret. This is the secret of free will, identical with the secret of the production of astral tourbillons in the most general form, hence some nebula and apparent contradiction in the presentation of this paragraph. So we're talking about free will. So remember our mages. These people are great personalities, right? They work their own will. So they're in command of their own tourbillons. Then Mebes, he talks about how astral cliches are available to clairvoyant psychics and so on, and that the cliches of any anomalies or events of a grandiose nature are easier to catch than others. So in the case of a person who's quite sensitive, these cliches may even be perceived whilst they're awake. Now he then speaks about the generation of astral larvae and how to get rid of them. I won't go into it here, except to say that he does mention the magical sword and that astral tourbillons will change their character near to the metal tip of the sword, which gets into the ganglionic nodes of the astrosome and causes the larva to decay. And larva in this case should be sought in the aura, the atmosphere of astral emanations in the subject. And similarly, he then speaks of healing physical wounds and illnesses and damage that's been done to the astrozone. He talks about elementals, telling us that they're not astral entities, but have a mental monad directed towards specially involutive activity, an astrozone that forms this activity, and a physical body that is invisible under ordinary conditions by the very uniformity of its structure with the environment in which these elementals operate. So the elemental of water will take the form of water, or of a tree, and then if you gaze long enough at it's probably maybe for me, I think, more readily noticeable in plants, and if you talk to them and commune with them, then you may in some ways perceive their elemental existence, their consciousness. So another point we learn from Mebes about the astral tourbillon, we're getting very occult here, is that it's the serpent bearing the sign of Jupiter with its head. And Jupiter signifies authority, the authority of man, carried into the world astral. The serpent bearing the sign of Jupiter. Now, in Arcanum 7, the chariot, he looks at how the very image on the card of two sphinxes, sometimes it's horses, drawing the chariot, is indicative of the astral talk corresponding to the medium term of the great Arcanum. One sphinx is dark, the other white. They pull in opposite directions, even though they look at each other. They run over the surface of a large globe, the quaternary of the elementary root of the great Arcanum. So the chariot, the very image of that chariot, indicates the astral force itself because of the light and the dark horses, also mentioned by Plato, the light and dark horses of the soul. In Arcanum 8, Justice, he emphasises the principle of balance inherent in the binary and expressed by the tourbillon, saying, if we perceive what is symbolically called by us one of the two forces that compose the pair, and recognise the existence of an astral vortex, a tourbillon, whose system includes the force that we see, then we must also recognise the existence of a second force that complements the first pairs and is therefore equal to it, parallel to it, but directed in the opposite direction. I'm looking like this because I did make a diagram. Oh, of course I can't find it anymore. Okay. Jumping further onto Arcanum 17, the star, which is linked to the chariot through the decad system. I want to highlight the deconstruction. 17 equals 2 plus 15 and 15 plus 2, wherein the metaphysical substance 2 and pure logic of 15 give hope, 17, star, indicating the triumph of the subtle in that they show us the power of pervasive deduction. Furthermore, the mystery of the relation of the sexes, related to the understanding of the formation of the tourbillon, gives the higher intuition, again the star, of universal love, to which we ascend through many steps, of which the first is the feeling of unity in matrimony. Thirdly, the world of achievements, 2, and karma, 15, of these achievements leave decipherable traits, 17. Now, having whizzed through that, we double back to Arcanum 4, the Emperor, the great Arcanum of magic. According to what we have learned about the oneness of the basic substance, all elements of mental, astral, or physical aspects of magical performance must be considered as individual manifestations, that is, as forming part of, respectively, a single mental element, the metaphysical axiom of a single astral element, the universal whirlwind, or of a single physical element, which is the point of support in the physical plane. Moreover, the mental principle must give birth to the astral form, and this, by its condensation, will inevitably determine physical manifestation. This action, in its totality, that is, the metaphysical axiom, the astral swirl, and the physical manifestation, constitutes the great arcanum of magic. The great arcanum, being the key to the greatest human power, is never revealed to the disciple by the instructor for the following reasons. And it's basically, it can be a danger to the initiator if the student's development is incomplete. And also because the second reason is that it's subjective in nature. So no matter what, all the teaching in the world will not help you to understand this until you live through it yourself, basically. And it will be very particular to you when it manifests and when you see it. Now, the great arcanum, like all magical operations, must have in its composition the mental part. The operator should understand and determine the most complete operation. In other words, should be oriented perfectly about the character of each entity, should know its origin. He must know his parents mentally, that is, he must understand the matrimony of each yod with each hey on the mental plane. The key to this understanding is hidden in the static in the great law of the ternary, which is symbolised by the ascending triangle, which constitutes the upper part of the scheme that alludes to the construction of the great arcanum of magic. And it was this that I did a diagram of for you before I done with it. Oh. Okay. I'll put the diagram in the thumbnail. The mental part of the arcanum, that is, the marriage of the determined yod and hey, will give rise to his astral part, the mystery of the basic whirlwind, the vow, the son of matrimony. As we have already explained in Arcanum 2, this whirlwind is bipolarized, and in addition it determines the passage of the mental plane to the physical and vice versa. In it lies the general mystery of involution and evolution. And graphically it's shown, if I can just, it's basically the seal of Solomon, so the 6-pointed star, the hexagram. And the corresponding number is 2, while the metaphysical part is numbered 3. And in the centre of this hexagram is the vow. So the top of the Great Arcanum of Magic is the upward triangle with the yod and the hey. The second part is the hexagram with the vow in the middle. The astral swirls of the general type, when condensed, should lead smoothly to the sphere of the elements, that is, to the physical world, mysteriously connected with the understanding of Arcanum 4. And that's the bottom of the Great Arcanum of Magic, which is a circle with a square and a cross and the second hey. This diagram is in the Mebes Tarot Mages book as well, in the Emperor Arcanum, so you can look that up if you have the book as well. And then it goes on to say it's graphically presented by 3 symbols, and the central one, this hexagram, is the binary of the astral rota, the swirl. Binary because it's 2 triangles, an upward triangle and a downward triangle. The lower part, the quaternary, is the mystery of achievement, the mystery of the point of support. And the attainment of the higher part depends on the degree of incarnation of the human being, his or her spiritual monad, which has the knowledge of the mystical marriage of the yod and the hey. For the realization of the intermediate part, the seal of Solomon, man must create in himself astrally the androgynous vow. Now I am going to do another talk about the tree of life and the placement of vow on the tree of life. You can basically visualize it as being part, the middle pillar, with the crown, the yod, at the top of the middle pillar, and the vow goes through to earth. That's essential for this mystical marriage. Now then, to form the lower part, the physical, it's necessary, besides the creation of the astral androgyne, to know both the instrument that will serve as the physical support and the passage from this point in support of the astral swirl. I know it's getting quite complicated. The point here is that the body is the great Athanor of the Arcanum of Magic. So if you think again of the tree of life, imagine that the middle pillar is akin to your spinal column. Once this is understood, it must be applied. And yeah, so basically this goes back again to the degree of understanding of the aspirant, and that it's all very well talking about it, but you've actually got to do it. You've got to confront the sphinx of the elements within yourself. He talks about the myth of Oedipus as a quaternary example. And he says that Oedipus, whilst he solved the question of the Sphinx, he did not resolve the astral binary of the Arcanum, and he was therefore dragged by the whirlwind into the horrors of patricide and incest. So his dominion over the physical alone was not enough to prevent what happened. The initiation of the astral plane was given to him by suffering, and on the mental plane he attained peace through the mystery of universal love, the self-denial and dedication of his daughter Antigone. And then apparently it's very significant that astral initiation reaches maturity in old age, as does the mental. Now then, he then goes into talking about magical rebounds. So basically the great mages who we met at the start of this talk, it's all very well that he goes, implementing magic and working his magic on people. But if you're going to go around working magic on people, because of the law of free will and the liberatio, which comes into effect from Arcanum 8, justice, we're open to the idea that this magic could rebound. So the basic nutshell of this is don't go cursing or committing bad acts of magic, because they're going to come back at you, basically. And even if you, the magus who is acting, are stronger than the one you are acting upon, the free will of the person, the principle of justice will amplify their defense mechanism, and it's going to be a bigger force that comes back at you. You might still be able to deal with it, and you might not. So the way he describes it is by a decomposition of Arcanum 8, 2 plus 6, where 2 equals gnosis or knowledge, and 6 is the law of reactions in the world. Therefore, in general, the work of an enlightened operator in the field of static and dynamic binaries. And this will inspire in the learned operator with caution, warning of the existence of return strikes when using astral whirlwinds in magical operations. And here he explains how this happens. And he particularly talks about love spells because that's what everyone's trying to do. So you know, I'm not in love. 10cc, they did a song about it, didn't they? So play that song and you'll understand what happens there. Now he then goes on to talk about the foundation of a religion, comparing this to the formation of a collective whirlwind, which will depend on the dynamics of its tetragrammatonic cycles. And of these cycles, the most important is the first, that begins with the point above the yod. And then he points out that religions need to find adepts, and therefore they must have a magnet to draw adepts to them. The magnet is, of course, the shin element that will win followers. And this one magnet, besides attracting to the egregore, those who are in tune with it, will also serve as a bond to retain those. So that's just the importance of a master in the religion. Thus, the first, if you're still with me, the first cycle of a religious whirlwind can be expressed by the formula point above the yod, yod he shin va he, and defined as materialization of the total or partial aspect of the teaching of the one source of truth in order to spiritualize a given environment. To recap the plan of a religion, the point above the yod corresponds to the purposes of the creation of an egregore. These must be selfless in the broadest sense of the word. The yod itself is the metaphysical content, which is a general or particular reflection of the one philosophy. The first he is constituted by the state and conditions of the environment in which the religion is founded. The shin is the aspect of the egregore capable of attracting and retaining adepts. The vow and the cult itself, the child of the environment, are fertilized by the principle of esoteric oneness. And the second he represents the final link of the first cycle, linking the preceding elements in the family, and determines the influence of the family, that is, the influence of the whole current of the external world. This is the politics of religion and the school itself. Now, he then takes us to Arcanum 15, the devil, which is pretty much very important on the matter of tourbillons, because like its counterpart in the Decad, Arcanum 5, if you think about those two cards, both the devil and the Hierophant have, in the case of the Hierophant, 2 aspirants kneeling before it, and in the case of the devil, 2 slaves. So, Arcanum 5 to the 10, the plane of man, an astral whirlwind kabbalistically created by the pentagram. That's Arcanum 15. I'm just seeing how much I want to... yeah, if you deconstruct 15, 1 plus 5 equals 6. This indicates the role played in this union by the astral whirlwind and warns against the dangers of Arcanum 6, since union can have both an evolving as well as an involutive character. So if you think about Arcanum 6, the lovers, again, there's a choice indicated there. That's your positive and negative, your 2 sides of the whirlwind. the forces that are equal but opposing, and in the case of the lovers, a choice needs to be made. So you better choose the evolving one, or you'll fall. We all fall, so you know. Now, just reverting to meditations on the tarot, Tom Berg's book. Here he says, the idea of hell can be understood as eternal existence in a closed circle, and the fall is a cosmic event, a whirlwind set in motion by the closed circle of the serpent biting his tail and sweeping down part of the creative world. The act of redemption involves no less than leading humanity out of this circle via a safe path of exit and into the living spiral, and transforming the fallen world from within by the radiation of the incarnated Word, who is Jesus Christ. Back to Mebes and Arcanum 15. For him, this Arcanum is a complete representation of the great astral whirlwind, including its superior influence, the triple flame of the metaphysical ternary, triangle remember, and the inverted mode of transmission of the astral cliché to the physical plane. The Foot Crusaders, he says. And it's necessary to understand that if on the one hand God gave a testament to Abraham, on the other hand the sincere metaphysical quest of Abraham magnetically attracted this gift. And he says, in the plane of the archetype, the whirlpool represents the unchanging logic to govern all metaphysical conceptions, until reaching and including the transcendent region of the second family Sephiroth. The transcendental region is not subject to its influence, hence comes the first title of the Arcanum, which is logic. In the field of humanity, the whirlwind is manifested by the intense attractions. Again, this mage, remember, who draws everything to him. And that according to inexorable laws from the astral plane, awaken and instigate desires. Attraction. The source of the desires is the collective nefesh that humanity has created since its fall. And the powerful whirlwind becomes a weapon in man's hand, a weapon he must use against others, or imperceptibly he makes of the man a slave. Sorry, my camera's annoying. Of other pentagrams who knew how to put themselves in the upper levels. The field of the whirlwind activity is universal humanity. On every planet in the uppermost levels of whirlwind, there is a genius working for the evolution of mankind on this planet. The lower planes of the same whirlwind are the sphere of the serpent's influence of planetary involution, which seeks to attract souls to the dark cone. In the case of Earth, this influence is manifested in the shape of the circular whirlwind, of which we speak in Arcanum 13, death. We're basically, in Arcanum 15, we're seeing the serpent that seduced Eve, is what he's building up to there. And then he starts talking about fate. And the negatively polarised names, Typhon, the devil. He says that Baphomet is a double whirlwind, whose upward movement receives the energy of the point of support in the coagulates, and the descendant of its point of suspension in the higher metaphysical principles. In one of the deconstructions, Kabbalah 10 must in part be created by the pentagram, but on the other hand, the pentagram must have been formed in a Kabbalistic way, not just in any way. The magic of the Templars, he said, had as a point of support a logic common to all mankind, and used in its operations the active power of the Nahash serpent. Templars took advantage of all the favourable circumstances of fate, that is, carefully planned activity, utilise the power of human desires and availing themselves immediately of favourable situations. Such magic is possible only when a pentagram is nourished by the Kabbalah, and this is in turn marked by the will of the same pentagram. Here it is indispensable that there be a Sabbath for the Son of Man, and that at the same time the Son of Man is the master of the Sabbath. And again we come to the point about the accomplishment of the aspirant, and he says that only self-understanding and the right job can achieve positive results. Merely possessing materials is insufficient. You can only do what you can do at the time that you can do it. So theory actually is useless, really. It's better to have the experience and then to apply the theory afterwards than the other way around. In fact, it's the only way. Now, I'm racing, I know, but that's because I had quite a lot of pages to get through. But we're now on to Shmakov. So out of this astral stuff a little bit. And with Shmakov, we're looking at the Force Arcanum 11. Now he says the second most significant difference between the second cycle of Arcana and the first is that all the Arcana starting from 11 to 20 carry their own negation in themselves. In other words, all the Arcana of this cycle are revealed in the binaries. And the decad is the more dynamic. That's why the binaries are inherent. Now, containing movement and furthermore being movement in itself, each arcanum of this cycle is a revealed, with absolute perfection, vortex. Each vortex is not only a closed and undivided, but also an uncomposable system. It's known from the mathematical theory of the vortex that the vortices can enter into all possible relations with each other, but none of them is destroyed and does not connect with the others. In full analogy with this, each arcanum of the second cycle, like an absolute cosmic vortex, completely independently permeating the entire universe, lives its own life and has its own purpose. Wheels within wheels sprang to mind. The two corresponding arcana, the Sephirothic and the active arcana, so the Sephirothic in this case would be the first, the Magus, and the active is the 11th force, there's a decad in between, are in an even deeper relationship than that observed between the noumenon and the phenomenon. The phenomenon is only the fixed form of the noumenon, motionless and lifeless. It has no will, no power of its own, no movement of its own. The phenomenon is, so to speak, only a captured view of the noumenon cross-section, but not the cross-section itself. The cross-section of the noumenon as an aspect of a self-sufficient force is in itself an infinite force. The phenomenon is a snapshot of this force. It is only a cliché. There is an echo, but not the sound itself. The active arcanum is the same noumenon as the Sephirothic arcanum. It is also the source of infinite power, and is itself a self-sufficient force. Both the one and the other have the same gift of creating phenomena through the imprinting of their aspects. Both of these arcana are only two states, two modifications of the same permanent essence. By introducing the element of movement, we pass from the Sephira to the active arcana. Eliminating it, we return to the Sephira. Purely empirically, we can already conclude that the elementary form of motion is a vortex, such as the atom and a cosmic nebula, both with an energy source that is incomprehensible in its own nature and reflected in a closed vortex motion. The vortex motion inherently contains the element of time, or rather extension, that is, the presence of a dimension in the coordinates of time. Because of this, the vortex motion in its very essence lies in a four-dimensional space and can be perceived by a person only in a projection of the plane of perception, lying in a metaphysical space, perpendicular to the coordinate of time. In this design, the vortex turns into a trajectory of motion which has the following form. The most general form of motion in three-dimensional space is a spiral wound on an elliptical cone, which is in projection on the horizontal plane gives an Archimedean spiral, which has a greater or lesser eccentricity with the centre of the circular section on the vertical plane, a decaying sinusoidal curve. In nature, in reality, there is only a true vortex motion, but since we perceive space by the method of coordinate projections, we do not get in each of them a component of the motion according to the metaphysical division, its element, but a projection of the whole in a distorted form. Ooh, he's a clever chap, isn't he, Shmakov? He's much cleverer than I am. This explains why the true nature of motion escapes investigation by applying, generally speaking, the conventional laws of mechanics adapted to three-dimensional space. And then okay, well, I'll just carry on with this. I know it's complicated, but so three-dimensional space. But knowing the true form of the trajectory of motion, we can decompose it into its component parts, into its elements, of which there are four: translational rectilinear motion, rotational motion, expansion motion, compression motion. All these four elements are inextricably linked and cause each other, and the first of them is caused directly by the noumenal action of the spirit, and the other three are its consequence, and by their nature arise from the environment in their totality. These three elements reveal the nature of the fluid, the prototype of all phenomenal movement in general. The teaching of this consciousness in its two aspects, the divine macrocosmic and the individual microcosmic, is the essence of Arcanum 5, the Pope. The change of the self-consciousness of the monad from the consciousness of itself as a part of a single whole to the consciousness of itself as a single reality does not depend on the very statement of the monad as such, its phenomenal manifestations. This change is born and proceeds in the spirit itself, in its spiritual self-consciousness, and therefore does not depend on but proceeds by principle, the very process of self-affirmation of the monad. The consciousness of oneself as a single substance, that is, a reality that has the gift of independent affirmation, is self-affirmation, the consciousness of oneself in one of the potentially inherent aspects, the emanation of one's consciousness outside of one's inseparable synthesis, which is an aspect of the divine spirit. This primordial creativity springs from and is based on the great schism of the individual spirit, the birth of binarity in the monad. The revelation of the individual monad from the depths of the universal spirit is the birth of a relative being, a world of phenomenal nature. In the pure spirit, its being as a substance depends on nothing, cannot be opposed to anything, cannot be compared with anything. The noumenal being cannot be expressed through any other concept or condition, because the whole is a particular aspect of this being and cannot reflect its fullness in our mind. Being phenomenal is always relative. Taken by itself, this concept has no meaning and gains power only when it's somehow coordinated by the same phenomenal connections with respect to the same phenomenal objects that are taken as stationary. The birth of a monad is the birth of a relative being, for the whole course of its self-affirmation is a succession of oppositions, mutual displacements and relative reorientations of the individual aspects potentially contained in the monad. Because of this, the identification of a single substance is the assertion of two aspects of self-consciousness of its essence as a synthesis of differential aspects, self-consciousness in the totality of aspects, and combining them into a single essence and self-consciousness in the essence and differentiating itself into its inherent aspects. The birth of these two aspects is the great split of the individual spirit. Consciousness and individuality have received a binary structure. From the state of a stationary principle, from a certain category of spirit determined by completeness and perfection, they have passed into a dynamic state and transformed into a closed vortex. The birth in consciousness of binarity, the binary principle, is the great schism of the spirit. As we consider the great pentagram of man, I was adding a bit here. As we consider the great pentagram of man, I am put in mind of not just myself, but so many other fellow travellers, as we studied meditations on the tarot in an hermetic virtual group which could go years without any form of communication. During active periods, it was remarked that we never seemed to get past the magician, Arcanum 1. And just as I was reading the text preceding, at the time I was writing it, a few weeks ago, I had a flash on why this might be. Basically, so great is the perceived schism of the initial progression towards duality, just from magician to high priestess, not to mention the self-contained joy and satisfaction of the inherent potential of the Magus archetype, the Aleph, that we as a group may have subconsciously or unconsciously held back from moving further around the wheel in a group setting before the necessary personal work had been undertaken, at least in part. So this also helps to explain why anybody with any degree of sort of consciousness might sometimes ask themselves, why don't other people wake up? Okay, I might not be fully awake, you might not be fully awake, but if you're a little bit awake, you might think, why is everyone just, walking around as if asleep, self-contained within themselves? That's because they do not want to experience the schism in their soul, which comes when you awaken. And it tends to, I think if it comes to you, it comes and you can't avoid it. But I can see why you wouldn't necessarily seek out the conditions by which that schism occurs. Deep within the Athanor, self-consciousness in unity, self-consciousness stationary, divine, lying on the other side of all antinomies, and therefore rising above all the possibilities of knowledge in the mind, gives birth to its external reflection. Self-consciousness in the aggregate of differential tonalities, self-consciousness dynamic, a vortex woven from the individual antinomies of the mind. The whole closed vortex is the manifested image of the substance in the mind, asserting its separate qualities and asserting itself in them. The substance manifests itself outside of its single essence according to the laws of pulsation. The vortex is not only a reflection of the substance in the mind, but it is also its true counterpart, its form in the world of the mind. When the substance establishes the vortex, two processes of self-knowledge take place. On the one hand, the substance, by the force of its own power, emanates a vortex outside of its unity, and on the other, by establishing itself in this vortex, it also asserts its essence as a synthesis of all the vortex possibilities. And here Shmakov has reinforced Mebes's earlier teaching that every vortex has a binary structure, because its very existence is defined as the totality of all the particular binary elements that are aspects of the main binary. Binary, as we already know, is born on the verge of being inseparable from the general synthesis and being single, quasi-independent. For this reason, in every pure binary, and consequently in every vortex, implicitly, there is a duality of self-consciousness of the substance that gave birth to this binary. In the plus term of the binary, the substance is aware of itself in the aspect of the unity of the synthesis that enamelled the particularity. In the minus term of the binary, the substance is aware of itself in the aspect of the confirmed separateness. The great schism of the spirit, the dismemberment of the self-consciousness of the individuality of the monad in the binary, is real, not only in the spiritual self-consciousness of the individual spirit, but is also imprinted, in virtue of what has just been said, in the totality of its phenomenal statements. So this reality is what you can't teach. If you've been through this schism, you'll know it. The individuality and consciousness of a person are always dual, and this duality is the genesis of the binarity of all kinds of perceptions of his manifested being. The doctrine of this primary additional polarity of the human being is the basis of all the teaching about man, and is the essence of Arcanum 5, which is therefore called a Magister Arcanorum, that is, the Arcana teacher. That's the Pope, the Arcana teacher. Ah. The world is a gigantic, grandiose vortex. It reigns over time and space. It contains everything in itself. And at every moment of what we call our time, it is always and invariably created and again descends into oblivion. The mental is a thought form, the astral is a form of thought, and the physical world is a form without thought. In the mental world, each idea, closed and complete, is a stable vortex that contains the whole set of opposite poles, all possible particular interpretations in the thought of this idea. The essence of the idea itself is an aspect of the spirit, and therefore it is not the essence of the idea itself that is contained in the mental world, but only the totality of expression in the mind, and moreover the totality is exhaustive. To resolve the binaries, you've got to be at proper nailed down poles. It's obvious that by embracing the entire mental vortex of a given idea with his consciousness, a person can combine the plane of his consciousness with any cross-section of this vortex. Individual sections of it are members of various possible binaural interpretations of the idea. Therefore, moving the plane of consciousness along the vortex ring, a person can eventually reach such a particular section of it that illuminates this idea from a diametrically opposite side and consequently is in binaural contradiction with a particular vortex section with which the plane of consciousness was previously combined. So from any point on one side of the binary, you can understand the whole of the opposite. This leads us to the knowledge of the doctrine of Arcanum 16 in its highest aspects. Each thought carries its own negation, being a concrete form for an idea. Each thought is connected by a logical chain with another thought, which is directly opposite to it. This latter follows not from the properties of human knowledge, but from the general laws of nature, the thunderstruck aspect of the tower. It's clear that when a person embraces the whole idea, the existence of this law only colours his own mental world with a bright pattern, only gives it an incessantly changing colour, and makes each particular shade of interpretation not a game of chance, but the result of a harmonious law. There is not and cannot be disappointment, painful bitterness and despair at the sight of this eternal change of forms living separately. When a person has not yet risen to embrace the given idea in its entirety, but knows only a finite series of its concrete interpretations, the particular sections of the vortex ring, then for him the law we have just learned has a completely different meaning. The individual aspects of the vortex ring are inclined to each other, and therefore the projections of their totality on each of them separately will be the more distorted, the more these aspects are distant. So, for example, aspects separated from each other by 90 degrees will seem to be absolutely unrelated to each other, and at a distance of 180 degrees they are diametrically opposite to each other. When striving for synthesis and knowing several separate interpretations, a person begins to generalize them. Then taking one aspect as the initial one, he leads the others to the main design. But starting from the first step, he is convinced of their difference of opinion about the very subject of the question, and so through various constructions, using the method of conscious ignorance, he begins to build the desired synthesis. In the beginning, this is relatively easy for him, but it becomes more and more difficult and finally becomes impossible. Then the big person begins the work from the beginning, taking some other aspect as the main one. He again makes his constructions, which in turn are doomed to failure. He can construct arbitrarily many such particular generalizations, particular syntheses, but all of them will be relative as long as he does not know the whole set of sections of the vortex in one way or another. Perfect cognition is achieved only by a series of successive attempts and successive failures. Each such failure is a crushing blow for a person, because at the moment of his experience it naturally seems to a person that all his work has been wasted. This gives us the doctrine of Arcanum 16 in its second aspect. All cognition, carried out by the method of successive approximation, is a series of attempts and constructions of particular syntheses which are successively destroyed by the emanation of the essence of the idea in its true synthesis. The ultimate goal which lies above the person not only attracts him to itself, but also sends blows that are stronger the more it attracts him, and vice versa. These blows at the moment of experience are extremely painful. It seems to a person that everything is lost, and only later he is convinced that once the blow is followed, it means that one stage of the ascent is over. Politics is a good example of never the twain meeting. Red, blue, don't understand each other, do they? Because they can't see far enough into their various principles, or they don't want to see far enough into their existing principles. They're hoping to get to the synthesis simply by following their own side, and it's impossible. A bird needs two wings to fly. Now then, having looked at the mental, he looks at the astral worlds, where every true feeling, complete, developed, which is a side of the perfect human soul, is composed of a whole range of the most delicate shades and the most subtle colours. When a person is perfect, when he is imbued with all the inflections of this feeling, he is able to embrace it completely, to embrace in his being this whole closed world. This vortex, consisting of a series of individual feelings, embraces the totality of individual members of the entire mass of closed experiences, generalised as a whole of the vortex. Such a person, transferring the plane of his consciousness to different points of this vortex, can experience individual gradations of feeling and move from one to another easily and freely without a shadow of suffering and pain, because their diversity only adds versatility to his general feeling. When a person has not achieved this, when the whole feeling has not yet been revealed in him, individual modulations of it, sometimes opposite to each other, fill his whole being with a disharmony of suffering. Love teaches us this, doesn't it? Having given himself up entirely to a group of feelings, having imbued himself with them and aspiring to a goal set, a person soon becomes convinced of the presence of a host of multilingual voices in his soul. He suffers, his feelings fall, a new one is born in him, and his change is sometimes almost infinitely painful. This leads us to the knowledge of two aspects of the doctrine of Arcanum 16, similar to the above. Every feeling of the person has its own negation in itself. Being a concrete form of a general feeling, each is inextricably linked to the other, which is directly opposite to it. This latter follows not from the properties of the human senses themselves, but from the general laws of nature. Now just remember again that the counterpart in the decad of Arcanum 16, the Tower, is the lovers. Yeah? Every feeling comprehended by successive scales of experience is a series of attempts and successive performances of particular sensations by various groups of feelings, which are destroyed by the emanation of the power of the essence of feeling in its true totality. The latter law is the basis of the theory of the return stroke. Any relative and therefore imperfect group of feelings on the basis of this law must inevitably lead to self-denial and return of all the energy invested in it. Only if such a group of feelings directed to the outside does not develop to its natural maximum, or even more so, is fed at the expense of the object by the addition of feelings that are in harmony with it and are equally imperfect, this return stroke may not occur. Sorry, I've got a bit of hay fever. I've got to blow my nose, sorry. It's very hot here. There's a lot of pollen. Now, the physical world. Each form is composed of a number of more differential forms. Each of them, like a captured moment, has only a limited concrete existence. A perfect person who sees unity and diversity in the cycle of forms feels the supreme just law. He feels the beauty of each, but does not attach more importance to them than it actually has. And he's talking about attachment, detachment, fluctuating between the essence and the form. The ordinary person here gets stuck. Yeah. A painful blow. The lowest aspects of the doctrine of the Arcanum 16 Life is a constant movement and eternal change of forms. The perfect man sees in this eternal cycle only one harmony, which reigns equally both in eternity and in the moment, in the whole galaxy of forms and in each of them separately. The man who has taken the form for the essence is only convinced of his error by its destruction, and therefore this blow, which throws the form to the dust, also throws him down. The hieroglyph of Arcanum 16 expresses this doctrine simultaneously in all these aspects. The third stage of creativity, mental, astral, physical, is expressed by the law of the magic chain, already partly known to positive science under the name of Ampere's law. Every current generates a vortex magnetic field around it. The transition from the second stage to the third is automatic, and the law of the birth of the vortex arises. As soon as the fulcrum is established, a vortex motion occurs. This vortex is the phenomenon of the medium, an analogue of the noumenal pulsing centre. The final stage of creativity is the birth of a vortex around the fulcrum, and it's clear that the assertion of this support can only be perfect when the asserting will is not only perfectly aware of the law of analogy, but also of the very automation of realisation. In other words, it's necessary to know not only the relation of the support to the noumenon, but also to the resultant phenomenon. The first is reduced to the law of analogy, and the second to the law of the vortex of the quaternary. This is precisely the eternal riddle of the Sphinx, which is offered to every new Oedipus who enters on the path of knowledge. The idea is expressed by the hieroglyph of Arcanum 22, the world. The Shekinah, the affirming consciousness of the spirit, holds two wands. They express the power of the birth of the vortex forces in the two aspects of the Brahman self, consciousness, and the spirit and the environment. The pose of the legs expresses its movement, consciousness forever passing from the spirit to the environment. The emblems of the elements and the serpents of Ananta represent the resultant cosmic vortex, the emblem of the transmission quaternary. The further path of the involution of the spirit, the law of the quadrupolar quaternary, is the doctrine of the second part of the Holy Book of Thoth, the small arcana of the tarot, which, by chance, I do actually have that with me. The binary structure of the set of qualities of the environment passes into the quadrupolar structure. In the vortex, the lot of Iod He Vau, He, is affirmed, for the extension of He He attracts the extension of Iod He. This stage of realisation is the transfer of activity to the environment itself, which is depicted by the traditional pentacle. The vortex is essentially different from the support vortex, which has a purely binary structure, the latter expressed by the traditional formula: the medium is a world of additional polarity. The quaternary lies on the outer edge of the medium and is a system in unstable equilibrium. Under the influence of the impulsive action of the noumenon, this vortex begins to rotate, so that each set of qualities of the medium, which at the primary moment are located amongst this quaternary, are successively under the action of all four poles of the quaternary. Therefore, each of them is itself transformed into a quaternary. This is expressed by the final law of realisation. The noumenal effect on the environment generates in it a system of quadrupolar quaternary in the form of a system of 16 objective forms. The operation of this law fulfills the requirement of the law of equilibrium. Each member of the quaternary contains in itself all the consequences that should have followed when interacting with others. This law is the foundation of the whole doctrine of the phenomenal world. Each noumenon is the phenomenal consciousness. In the phenomenal consciousness must be illuminated from 16 different points of view, 16-petal lotus. When we bring this law to its highest maximum, we see that the highest idea, the idea of the deity, must result in the 16 supreme principles. And he quotes from the Bhagavata Purana: "In the beginning, Bhagavat, wanting to create the world, took the form of Purusha, spirit and man world, a form composed of 16 parts of Mahat, mind and other principles." The Holy Book of Thoth, as a doctrine, is essentially noumenal. In itself it lies above the law of the quadrupolar quaternary. It is one in principle, but in order to be fully realised in our phenomenal consciousness, it must be stated in 16 aspects. The fulfillment of this task is the future goal of the human mind. In this study, I have mainly adhered to the following aspects: cosmogenic, energetic, theory of knowledge, psychological, ethical, religious, and partly touching on others. It then points out that the Sanskrit word vivartha means vortex. And then there's a reaffirmation of the tetragrammaton principle of the founding of a religion with the shin element as the magnet. And the reminder that the first cycle of a religious whirlwind can be expressed by the formula point yod he shin vav he, and defined as materialization of the total or partial aspect of the teaching of the one source of truth in order to spiritualize a given environment. The symbolism of the terms of the first cycle of a religious whirlwind can be expressed in the following scheme in the plan of a religion. Whew, and that was what I extracted from the encyclopedias about tourbillons. And I'm sorry if it was a bit of a whirlwind, but that's because it was quite a lot of text, and I've been speaking for over an hour, and my camera kept on working, unlike the last time I tried to read it when my camera just broke as soon as I started speaking. So yippee-doo-dah hey. Thank you for listening. I hope some of it made sense.